Good afternoon and welcome back to Stories with Don. I'm reading another short story of Patrick F. McManus. This is from his collection called They Shoot Canoes, Don't They? And this short story is entitled Tenor Shoes. And I relate to this story a little bit because when I was young I used to wear tenor shoes, so I know what he's talking about. "Why don't you throw out some of these shoes?" my wife shouted from inside the closet. "Are you crazy, woman?" I replied. "I need all those shoes. My bowling shoes, my jogging shoes, my hiking shoes, my canoeing shoes, my sailing shoes, my black dress shoes, my brown dress shoes, my brown casual shoes, my black casual shoes, my white casual shoes, my moccasins, my hip boots, my waders, my canvas wading shoes, my hunting boots, my mountain climbing boots, my down booties, my camp shoes, my sandals, my—" "Stop! Stop!" my wife screamed. "I give up. You can keep them. What I wish, though, is that somebody would invent a pair of shoes that could be used for everything." Well, as a matter of fact, someone once did. I wore them every summer when I was a kid. The shoe's inventor, I believe, was a Mr. Tenor. At least that's what we called them, tenor shoes. Once a rich kid moved to our town and tried to tell us that the shoes we were wearing were not called tenor shoes at all, but tennis shoes. We'd never seen anyone as ignorant as that kid. He didn't even wear tenor shoes, so we wondered why he thought he knew so much about them. "You trying to tell us these shoes weren't invented by a Mr. Tenor?" Wretch Sweeney said to the kid. "How come everybody calls them tenor shoes then?" Excuse me. "Only illiterates call them tenor shoes," the kid shot back. Naturally, this got us all riled up, and we started yelling at him and pushing him and trying to get him to fight one of us. "Listen," Pee Wee Thompson said, "we're all just as normal as you are, except for maybe Birdie. He's a little weird." "No, no." Well, I lost my place here. "No, no," the rich kid shouted. "Illiterate means you don't know how to read and write." Well, as soon as we found out that we hadn't been insulted, everybody cooled down and started patting the kid on the back and telling him he was all right after all, and we hoped he wouldn't harbor any feelings against us because of just a little misunderstanding. "Just the same," Wretch said, "I ain't never heard of anybody by the name of Tennis." "I once did," I said. "I think his son was one of them English poets, but I doubt either one of them knew anything about shoes." Tenor shoes were made out of black canvas and had rubber soles and little round patches over the part that cover your ankle bones. They were ugly. Tenor designed them that way on purpose so girls wouldn't want to wear them. You got your pair of tenor shoes each spring about the time the snow began to recede from the lowlands. There was an interesting little ritual that went with the purchase of each year's tenor shoes. My mother would take me down to Hobbs' dry goods store, where Mr. Hobbs himself waited on the shoe customers. "Howdy," Mr. Hobbs would say. "By golly, I bet you brought that young colt in to get him shod." Mr. Hobbs and my mother would cackle at monotonous length over this witticism. Interestingly enough, when I was very young and first heard the little joke, I thought Hobbs had said to get him shot. My fright was such that I behaved myself for the better part of the day and wondered long afterwards in what manner my sentence had been commuted. Hobbs' arsenal of wit seemed to consist of the single joke, and as soon as he had spent that round on his customers, he seemed to revert immediately into his natural self, perhaps best described as peevish. "Sit down and take off your shoes," he would order. The shoes he referred to were generally some kind of clodhopper boots, well along into the first stage of oblivion. heels and tongue missing, soles flopping loose, seams gapping, the laces a Chinese puzzle of knots and frayed ends. As I peeled off the boots, Mr. Hobbs and my mother would both leap back and gasp. "I thought I told you to wash your feet," my mother would screech, more for Mr. Hobbs' benefit than my own. "I've never seen the likes of it." Mr. Hobbs would mutter under his breath about having seen the likes of it, something about hygiene films and Navy boot camp. "How's that?" my mother would say. "Nothing," Mr. Hobbs would snort. "Nothing." He would then lock one of my feet in a measuring device, all the while doing his impression of a person removing a long dead rat from a trap. The measurement taken, Hobbs would get up and return shortly with a box of tennis shoes, which he would drop in my lap and order me to try on. Even to this day, I recall with ecstasy the pure, sensual delight of slipping my feet into a brand new pair of tennis shoes, my old toes up in the forward part wiggling around, checking out their new quarters, the ankles swelling boastfully under the protective cushions of the rubber patches as the fat, clean laces snugged tight in the embrace of canvas and rubber. After a winter of wearing the clodhopper boots, I felt like I was wrapping on a pair of wings. "I better go try 'em out," I would say. "Stay in the store," Mr. Hobbs would shout. "Don't take them out of the store." But it would be too late. I would be out on the sidewalk, and the tennis shoes would be carrying me in free soaring flight around the block. The test completed, I would brake to a screeching stop and re-enter the store. "Maybe just a half size larger," I would tell Mr. Hobbs. Gosh, I don't know why anyone would let their dog run loose on the sidewalk. But I wash these tennis shoes off as good as new in a mud puddle as soon as they dry. "Dog?" Mr. Hobbs would say. "Dog? Nothing doing. These are your size. That'll be 98 cents, ma'am." 98 cents, my mother would say. My land, I don't know what folks are going to do if prices keep going up the way they are. "Terrible," Mr. Hobbs would mutter. "Don't know these young whelps are worth it anyways." He always sounded as if he meant it, too. To my mind, the tenner was the ultimate shoe. You could use it for running and hiking and jumping, for playing football and basketball, hunting and fishing, mountain climbing, rafting, spelunking, swimming, bicycling, horseback riding, cowback riding, pigback riding. Whatever the activity, the tennis shoe adapted itself to the task in noble and admirable fashion. The one area in which the tennis shoe may have fallen a bit short was as a dress-up shoe. Suppose, for example, that you had to go to some social event where all the youngsters were dressed up in their best clothes. You showed up wearing your good pair of pants, your good shirt, your good socks, and your tennis shoes, which by now may have been showing the strain of hunting, fishing, pigback riding, etc. Now, as soon as you got within hearing distance of some of the other mothers at the affair, your mother would look down at your feet, conjure up an expression of absolute horror, and say, "I thought I told you to wear your brown Oxfords. My land, you'll mortify me to death. Just look at those filthy old tennis shoes." Now, of course, all the other mothers would look at your mother and smile and shake their heads in an understanding way as if to say, "What can you expect from a little boys?" What was truly shrewd about this charade was your mother's use of the phrase, "your brown Oxfords." This not only implied that you had brown Oxfords, but also black ones and possibly white ones. Maybe one of the reasons the ruse worked so well was that most of the other guys had protruding from the cuffs of their good pairs of pants the unmistakable rubber nose of tennis shoes. If there was a poor kid present at one of these social functions, by the way, his mother would look down at his feet and say, "Land sakes, Henry, didn't I tell you to wear shoes?" Of course, all us other guys knew that Henry didn't have any shoes. Otherwise, why would he paint his feet to look as if he were wearing tenners? It made you kind of sad if you thought about it. The great thing about tenors was their almost unlimited versatility. They were great for wearing inside a sleeping bag, for example. Nowadays, of course, there are little down booties especially designed for wearing inside of sleeping bags. The one problem with these booties is they aren't designed for outside wear. And if you have to get up in the night for any reason, they're not much good for wandering around over rough ground in the dark. Of course, when you're camping out as a kid, there is only one thing that can make you get up in the middle of the night, and that is the necessity of running for your life. And if ever there was a shoe designed for running for your life, it was the tenor. Many was a dark night that a troop of us young campers made our way home, trailing in our wake the distinct odor of smoldering tenors. Tenors made great fishing waders. Mr. Tenor, who must have been an absolute genius, had designed them without any insulation, so that when you waded out into an icy spring stream, it took only a few minutes for your feet to turn numb. From then on, you could fish in complete comfort. The numbness also prevented you from feeling any pain when your tenors slithered into the narrow and odd-shaped openings between slippery rocks. You could continue fishing in blissful comfort up above, while down below the rocks committed various acts of depravity on your feet, rearranging the bones in imaginative ways, doing trick shuffles with your toes, and playing football with your ankles. We would often return from a fishing trip with an affection known technically as cauliflower feet. Fortunately, we had the good sense never to remove our tenors until they had dried, thereby preserving our feet in the shape, if not exactly of feet, at least of tenors. Indeed, I was often afraid to remove my tenors after a fishing trip, for fear of what I might find inside of them. I have always had a weak stomach. There was considerable controversy among us about how often tenors should be taken off. The conservatives argued for once a week, the liberals for 3 or 4 times a summer, and the radicals for never, preferring to allow decay and disintegration to take their natural course. Although I was one of the conservatives, I shared the radicals' curiosity over whether, when their tennis shoes finally destructed, there would be any feet left inside. I frequently shared space in small tents with tenor radicals, and the idea occurred to me more than once to take a caged canary in with me, so that its sudden demise would warn me when the gas escaping from the radical tenors had reached a lethal level. To my knowledge, there were never any human fatalities from this cause, although large numbers of flying and crawling insects in the tent died mysteriously. There were many other theories concerning the proper use of tenor shoes. These theories were passed on from the older fellows to the younger ones, and were usually taken at face value. One of the theories was passed on to me by my cousin Buck, several years my senior, who told me that little slits should be cut in the canvas of new tenor shoes so that in an emergency you could thrust some of your toes out through the slits and get better traction. This seemed to me to be a good idea, even though I could never bring myself to cut a brand new pair of tenors. It was just as well. In fact, I'll never forget the day I saw this theory put to the test. Buck had taken me on a little hiking trip in the mountains for the purpose of instructing me in woodcraft. He was one of those people who love to teach but can never be bothered learning anything. What Buck taught me was an odd thought that happened to pop into his head, and some of the thoughts were pretty odd. He taught me, for example, that woodpeckers were tapping out code on the trunks of dead trees, warning other woodpeckers of our approach. He even let me in on the secret that he had cracked this code and knew what they were saying. Sometimes, he said, the woodpeckers even made jokes in code, and Buck had to laugh when he heard them. "What did that one say?" I would ask Buck when he laughed. "Oh, you're too little for me to repeat a joke like that," he would say. "But I can tell you this, them woodpeckers is pretty funny birds." It turned out that Buck's theory about slitting tenors to stick your toes out was on par with his knowledge of ornithology. After what happened that day in the mountain, I never again had any use for Buck's teachings. What happened was this. We were walking along single file, with Buck, of course, in the lead, reciting all sorts of incredible nature lore to me. The weather was chilly and the earth on the mountains frozen hard, with patches of snow still lingering here and there. As we were making our way down the unexplored backside of the mountain, we came to a huge slab of rocks approximately 50 feet square and slanting down to a drop-off. The surface of the rock was smooth and covered with frost. Buck started walking straight across the rock. I stopped. "What you stop for?" Buck asked, turning around about halfway across the slab. "Tennis shoes don't slide on rock. The little suction cups on the soles, they grab right onto the..." Buck was sliding. "Well, this frost makes it a little slick," he said. "I better..." By now, Buck was really sliding. He gave up all efforts at further conversation and devoted his full attention to scrambling back up the rock. The problem was that no matter how fast and furious Buck's scramble was, his downward rate of slide seemed to be greater by about an inch per second. I had no idea how much of a drop awaited at the brink of the slab. 100 feet? Half a mile? I remembered all the mountain climbing movies I'd ever seen, where a climber loses his grip and plummets downward until he is just a tiny, noisy speck hurtling towards the patchwork farmlands below. From the look on his face, I knew Buck was remembering the same movies. Then I noticed that Buck had forgotten to stick his toes out through the slits in his tenors. "Stick your toes out, Buck!" I screamed at him. "Stick out your toes!" Buck's toes suddenly emerged from the slits like little pink landing gear. And I have to admit that he did some marvelous things with his toes. In fact, just about everything it is possible to do with toes and not get arrested. But nothing worked. Buck shot backward right off the edge of the cliff. His drop was accompanied by a long, horrible, slowly diminishing scream. I was a bit puzzled by the scream, since Buck was standing there on a wide ledge, just 3 feet down from the brink of the slab, his whole top half still in full view of me. Later, he tried to tell me that he was just doing his imitation of a Tarzan ape call. Well, I'd heard his imitation of Tarzan's ape call numerous times, and it had never before made my hair stand out on end. Buck was finished as a mentor. I was just happy that I hadn't followed his advice, and violated a perfectly good pair of tenors by cutting slits in them for an emergency. As with all good things, tenors did not last forever. Spring eased into summer, and summer wore on, and the tenors would begin to fade, the dark, rich black of the canvas turning to pale, dirty gray. Then the seams where the rubber was glued to the canvas would start to peel loose. The eyelets for the laces would begin popping out. The laces themselves would break and have to be knotted. Their ends would fray out into tiny pom-poms. The round rubber ankle patches would fall off. The canvas at the balls of the feet would wear through. Then a tear would move back along the instep. By September, the tenors would be done for. On the first day of school, your new clodhopper boots felt good. Their weight gave you a sense of security, of substance, of manhood, and the will to face another year of school. But there would be a note of sadness, too, because Henry, the poor kid, would be there, his feet painted to look like new boots. You tried not to think about him. My wife's muffled voice came from inside the closet. "How about this pair of shoes? Can I at least give these to the Salvation Army?" "Those old tennis shoes? Sure, go ahead," I said. Heck, I never play tennis anyway. And that is the end of that story. Yeah, I used to own tennis shoes, and it's pretty much like he said. They would be great. You felt like you could never run as fast in them as when you first put them on. And by the time they were done, they stunk and they'd fallen apart. Everything he said was accurate. Well, anyway, I hope you have a good rest of the day, that you stay well. May God bless you. Goodbye.